I chose him on a Tuesday. I remember the day because Advisor Orvath had spent the entire morning briefing me on why I could not. 3 candidates from the Velsorn senior security cohort, 2 from the external contractor roles, both of them Velsorn affiliates, which made them, in practice, cohort candidates with different paperwork. All of them presented with the same word, appropriate. He said it 11 times. I counted because counting was something to do while he spoke that kept me from saying what I was thinking. Appropriate rank, appropriate lineage record, appropriate species, appropriate combat history, appropriate standing within the court's existing framework. By the 11th time I had stopped listening and was reading the compact contractor file I had pulled the previous evening, which had been sitting under my palm on the desk the entire time he spoke. I said the 6th candidate. He looked at the file I slid toward him. He looked at it for a long moment, long enough that I knew he had seen it before, or had been told to expect it, which meant someone in the records office had reported the file request the night before. The court had its channels. I had mine. We had both known for some time that the period after my husband's death was a period of calibration, and that calibration would resolve into something, and that both of us were deciding what that something would be. He said, with the careful diplomatic register he used when he wanted to sound neutral and wasn't. The compact contractor role is designed for secondment to commercial postings, freight corridors, trade way station security, low-tier diplomatic escorts. The Velsorn Sovereign Protective Detail carries both legal weight and historical precedent. Perhaps her sovereignty might wish to reconsider the pool. I said, have him here by the 3rd hour. Orvath was too practiced to let his face do anything significant. He inclined his head. He said he would arrange it. He took the file, which was the first mistake he made that morning. I had intended him to read it but not keep it, and left. I sat at the desk for a moment after he was gone and looked at the south garden window and thought about my husband. He had been very good at this particular kind of standoff. He had a quality of stillness that read as patience to people who didn't know him and read as certainty to people who did. Orvath had known him for 22 years and had never been entirely sure which it was, which was part of why my husband had been able to manage him. I was not my husband, but I had watched him manage Orvath for 14 years of our marriage, and I had learned the mechanics of it, and the main mechanic was simply this. You do not explain your reasoning until after the decision is made, because explaining invites negotiation, and negotiating from the chair is not the same as deciding from it. I had already decided. His name was Joram Castle. 41 years old, the file said, though he looked neither young nor old in the way that makes age easy to read. He was compact, that is the right word, and I mean it precisely. Not small exactly, though he was shorter than every member of my previous security detail by a significant margin and lighter than any of them by perhaps a third. But compact the way a field survey instrument is compact. Everything present, nothing redundant. No part of the design wasted. He had gray at his temples and a jaw that had been broken at least once and had healed slightly wrong, and he wore a plain gray contractor's jacket that had been washed so many times the fabric had gone soft at the elbows. He carried his credentials flat in both hands when he entered the proceeding room, the way a person carries something they intend to put down rather than perform. The court was present for the appointment proceeding. They were always present. The proceeding room opened off the southeast corridor of the throne annex, and the senior staff used any formal appointment as an occasion to observe and advise, and when they felt the Queen was making an error, to make that observation available through a series of expressions. I had learned to read the way my husband had taught me to read weather fronts moving in off the northern plateau. Advisor Orvath stood 2 paces behind my left shoulder. Senior Cohort Commander Velthar Dean was positioned beside him, which was technically outside his formal role in an appointment proceeding, and which both of us understood was not an accident. There were 9 other members of the standing court arranged along the east wall, which was 4 more than typically attended a security appointment, And I noted this the way I noted everything in those months, quietly, and without responding to it directly. I remember Joram Castle's walk across the length of the preceding room. He did not look at the ceiling, which is where most people look first in a room of that scale. The throne annex ceiling is 8 meters at the crown and carved with the full sovereignty seal and 7 generations of ancestral linework, and it draws the eye. He did not look at me, which is where nervous candidates look and experienced ones pretend not to. He looked at the walls, not in the way of admiring the carved sovereignty panels and the 7 ancestral banners and the amber inlay floor. He looked at them the way a person takes a measurement. Left wall, entry arch, right wall. The 2 side corridors visible from where he stood and the distance to each. The positioning of the court staff along the east wall. He noted each person without making it obvious that he was noting them, which I saw because I was watching for it. Then the floor between him and the dais. Then me. He said, "I am Joram Castle, licensed independent contractor, Compact Joint Forces Infantry, retired senior sergeant. Your sovereignty reached out through the compact contractor role. I am here." He did not say it would be an honor. He did not say he was grateful for the consideration. He did not produce the small formal speech that candidates typically produced, the one about dedication and long service and the privilege of serving the Velsorn house. He said what was true, and then he stopped talking, and in the room behind me, I heard the particular quality of silence that means the observers have registered something they were not expecting. I said, "You understand the position." He said, "Protective detail, sovereign principle, residential and transit contexts, standard threat response protocols with sovereign preference overlay." Yes. I said, "The previous detail was dissolved 4 months ago following my husband's death. The circumstances of the dissolution are noted in your briefing file. I will not revisit them here." He said, "I read the file." I said, "Do you have questions about the role?" He said, 1. Is the candidate list I am on the list the sovereignty prepared or the list you chose from? I looked at him. It was a good question. It was a precise question, the kind of question that can only be asked if the person asking it has read the briefing file carefully and understood what the briefing file revealed and what it didn't, and has decided that the gap between those 2 things is the most important thing to clarify before agreeing to anything. I said the latter. He said, "All right." That was the appointment. Advisor Orvath asked for the floor afterward and delivered a 3-minute statement on the historical precedent for intra-sovereignty protective appointments and the reputational implications of the compact contractor role, which was not designed for the formal requirements of sovereign detail work, and the practical difficulty of integrating an external hire into existing palace security protocol, which required a level of institutional familiarity that typically took years to develop within the Velsorn framework, and the court's legitimate interest in ensuring that the principal's security arrangement reflected the standing of the position. He spoke in the measured register he used when he had prepared his remarks in advance, which meant he had been expecting this outcome for longer than he had let on. Joram Castle stood at attention in his post position during the statement. I watched him peripherally. He listened to Orvath's 3 minutes without expression and without shifting his weight, which most people do after the first 90 seconds of a prepared statement, and when Orvath finished, Joram's face had the quality of a room that had been recently vacated, all the furniture in place, nobody home. I said, "Thank you, advisor. The appointment is confirmed. We will begin orientation this afternoon." Orvath inclined his head. The expression behind the incline for exactly 3 seconds was the one I have learned means he intends to revisit this through other channels. I noted it. I said nothing. We began orientation. The first 3 days were quiet in a way I had not expected. I had anticipated friction between Joram and the palace staff who were accustomed to the previous details methods, between Joram and the residual members of my former security arrangements, who still held building rotation responsibilities, between Joram and the physical environment of the palace itself, which was built for Velsorn proportions, and tended to make anyone outside those proportions look somewhat installed rather than native. Previous external hires had that quality within the first day, the slight hesitation at thresholds scaled for taller frames, the tendency to navigate halls by following others rather than reading the space themselves. Joram had none of that. He learned the residential and formal wing layouts in a single afternoon. I watched him do it, not obviously, but I was working in the East Archive with the door open, and the archive overlooked the main corridor junction, and he came through twice with the measured walk, pausing at each junction and archway and juncture between wings, and I could see him mapping it the same way he had mapped the preceding room. On the evening of the first day, he sent a written daily report. I had not requested one. It was simply there when I came to the desk after the evening briefing. It listed his movements through the palace during orientation, the access points he had identified, the schedule patterns he had observed among the household staff, and a set of questions organized by priority. The questions were specific. They were about things the briefing file had not covered. The actual rhythm of my daily movement between wings rather than the official schedule, the staff access permissions to the residential corridor, the South Garden's exterior approach points, and their current security state, the communication protocols between the palace and the Velsorn Sovereignty formal guards stationed at the perimeter. I read the report twice, then I answered the questions. He came to the East Archive in the morning of the second day, and I gave him the answers in person, because the answers to the South Garden questions were not things I wanted in writing. He listened without taking notes on the questions he had clearly already memorized, and then nodded once, and said he would take care of the garden access points that afternoon. He did. That evening's report listed the 3 external approach points that had been unsecured, the 2 that had been technically secured but whose security mechanisms were outdated, and the remediation he had put in place for each. I showed the report to Commander Dean informally. He read it without comment, which was its own comment. On the second day, he moved a chair. This sounds like a minor thing and was not. The chair was in the corridor outside the private audience room, a formal piece, carved amberwood, sovereign seal back, positioned there by a tradition that predated my tenure and probably predated my mother-in-law's tenure, and had simply never been questioned because it had always been there. It commanded an excellent view of the East Wall's 7th century sovereignty mural. It commanded an extremely poor view of the 3 corridor approaches that converged at that junction, which was the junction from which anyone moving between the residential wing, the throne annex, and the South Garden access corridor would have to pass. He moved it 14 centimeters to the left and rotated it 40 degrees. He did not ask permission. He noted it in the evening report. Repositioned corridor post seating, East Annex Junction. Original position provided no sightline to east or north approach corridor. Adjusted position covers all 3 approach corridors from a single seated vantage point. The mural remains visible from the adjusted position. I read that 3 times, specifically the last line. The mural remains visible. He had thought about the mural. He had thought about why the chair had been placed where it was, not security, never security, but something older and more Velsorn than that. A sense that the corridor outside the private audience room should convey a certain gravity, that the person sitting in it should have their gaze drawn to 7 centuries of sovereignty carved into amber plaster. He had thought about this, and he had kept it, and he had also fixed the sightline problem, and he had reported both as a single action. I filed the report in the correct archive. I thought about it for several days. There were other things in those first 3 days that I noted and did not act on immediately. On the morning of the second day, he asked to speak with the head of the household kitchen staff about delivery schedules to the residential wing. I learned afterward that the conversation lasted 11 minutes and that he had asked about which contractors supplied the residents, how long those contracts had been in place, and whether any new service personnel had been added to the residential delivery roster in the past 6 months. The kitchen supervisor had answered all of it with the slightly startled efficiency of someone who has been asked sensible questions they had not thought to ask themselves. That afternoon, he submitted a written request to the records office for the background documentation on 2 of the newer roster additions. The records office routed the request to Orvath's administrative secretary, because the records office routed nearly everything through Orvath's administrative secretary, and the administrative secretary sent me a note asking whether the contractor's records access should be limited to security-relevant materials. I wrote back, no. The note I received in response was silent, which was its own answer. On the 3rd day, in the late afternoon, I was in the East Archive reviewing boundary survey documentation that had been waiting for my attention for 6 weeks. Since before the dissolution of the previous detail, since before a number of things, and the archive was quiet, and the light through the high windows was the particular amber gray of late afternoon in the long season, and I put down the survey folio and found myself thinking about a question. He had asked it at the appointment proceeding. Is the candidate list the one the sovereignty prepared, or the one you chose from? It was a precise question. It told me he had read the briefing file carefully enough to understand the gap between what the file said and what the appointment proceedings context implied, that the sovereignty and I were not, on the matter of this appointment, aligned. It told me he had wanted to know before agreeing to anything whose judgment he was agreeing to work under. It told me that there was a difference in his assessment between those 2 things, and that the difference mattered to him. My husband used to say that the most useful question a person could ask before joining any arrangement was, who is actually making the decisions here? He said most people never asked it because they assumed the answer was obvious from the formal structure. He said the formal structure was frequently wrong. I went to the corridor. He stood when I appeared in the doorway, which was protocol, and then went still when I leaned against the doorframe rather than indicating that I was passing through. I said, I want to ask you something directly. He said, all right. I said, the compact contractor file lists your last active posting as a frontier garrison, Threscale Marginal, 4 years prior. Before that, 18 years of compact joint forces infantry, 6 of them on Deathworld adjacent operations. The file uses that phrase. I want to know what that means in practical terms, not the administrative category, what it means for the person in it. He looked at me for a moment. Then he said, it means we operated in environments where the baseline conditions, atmosphere, temperature range, pressure variance, microbial load, the aggression profiles of local fauna, were within the range a human being can survive if they have been trained for it and equipped for it and are willing to accept what surviving it costs. Not the worst-rated worlds. Those are classified and the operations there are logged separately, but the adjacent tier. The ones that the compact considers marginal rather than prohibited. I said, and what does surviving it cost? He said, the body adapts. That is the documented version. The immune response changes, the baseline shifts to a level that handles what killed you in the marginal zones and doesn't notice what would kill most people in ordinary contexts. Reflexes accelerate, the nervous system recalibrates around faster threat timelines. Pain threshold rises, which sounds useful and is also not entirely comfortable to live with. Healing rate increases. All of it is documented in the compact medical record attached to the contractor file, which I assume you read. I said I read it. He said, then you know what the documentation shows. What it doesn't show is that the adaptations are permanent. You come out of the marginal zones changed, not in ways that are visible, but changed in ways that do not go back. I said, the file notes combat evaluation scores in the upper classification tier. He said, yes. I said, It does not elaborate on what those scores mean in practice. He said, "That is correct. The classification tier is the number. What the number represents is a set of exercises conducted under standard compact assessment conditions. The scores reflect performance in those conditions. They do not reflect what performance looks like in conditions that are not standard, because the compact's assessment conditions assume a baseline that the marginal zone experience has moved past." He said this without anything I could call pride or display. He said it the way he said everything, as a factual account, offered completely, nothing performed. I said, "And the contractor role? After 18 years of frontier postings and marginal operations, why the contractor role?" He said, "I left the service at 37 because I had served what I had intended to serve and I was done. The contractor role is what the compact offers veterans who want to continue working without returning to active service. I applied and was accepted. I have had 3 prior postings, each concluded with a commendation. The files are attached." I said, "I read those too. Why this posting specifically? There were others on the roll when I contacted it." He said, "Yours was the 4th file I reviewed after the roll contact. The first 3 I declined." I said, "Why?" He said, "The first 2 were freight corridor postings. Legitimate work, not interesting. The 3rd was a diplomatic escort for a trade delegation. I did not feel I would be useful in that context. Yours was different." I said, "Different?" He said, "You pulled the contractor role yourself, not through your advisory staff. The contact was made from an internal sovereign records access point in the evening, after standard working hours. The candidate selection criteria in the request were written in a different register from the official briefing file. The briefing file had been composed by someone in the advisory staff, but the selection criteria had been written by someone who reads threat assessments. I thought, this is a person who has looked at what is actually in front of them and is selecting accordingly. I wanted to work for someone who does that." I said nothing for a moment. He said, "I also read the garrison logs from your husband's early frontier postings, not the official record, the daily operational logs. He was precise and he was honest, and he made appointments on the basis of what people could actually do rather than on what they're doing it looked like. The briefing file said you were the same. I believed it." I went back into the archive. He returned to his post. I sat at the desk with the boundary survey folio in front of me and did not read it for a while. The trouble with Advisor Orvath was not that he was malicious. I have worked with people who were malicious, and I knew what that looked like, and Orvath was something different and in some ways more difficult. He was political, which is a specific kind of orientation. A person who makes all their judgments in terms of what the judgment costs and what it purchases, and whose currency is influence rather than outcome. My husband had managed him by being better at the same calculation, faster, more patient, more willing to let an advantage accumulate over time before using it. Orvath had known this and had worked within it, because he had understood that working within my husband's framework was better for him than working against it. My husband was gone. The court was in the uncertain period that follows a death of that significance, the period where the formal structures remain in place but everyone within them is quietly recalibrating, assessing what the loss means for their own position, making small moves to establish ground. Orvath had been making those moves for 4 months, not rapidly, not in ways that were easy to name, but I had been watching him with the attention my husband had trained me to apply, and I saw the accumulation. The bodyguard appointment was, from Orvath's perspective, an error on my part that was also an opportunity. An error because I had made it without consulting him, which he would have preferred. An opportunity because the appointment was, to the court's eye, laughable. A small, quiet human from the compact contractor role in a gray jacket with no house affiliation and a broken nose, and a lineage record that was simply missing, in the way that frontier posting veterans' lineage records are frequently missing, not suppressed, not complicated, just not relevant to the places they had been and the work they had done. The court understood that a Velsorn sovereign protective detail was a statement as much as a security arrangement. It said something about the sovereign who chose it. What Joram Castle said to the court, standing in the proceeding room in his soft gray jacket with his flat credentials, was that the Queen's judgment had faltered in the aftermath of her husband's death. Orvath let that narrative establish itself for 6 days. Then he moved. He filed the formal demonstration request on the morning of day 6, routing it through the standard court protocol mechanism for security appointment review. The mechanism was entirely legitimate. It existed precisely because sovereign protective appointments had, in the historical record, occasionally been made on the basis of personal preference rather than verifiable capability, and the standing court had a formal role in ensuring that the principal's security was not compromised by that preference. The mechanism required 3 co-signatories from the standing court. Orvath had 6. The documentation was clean. The procedural language was correct. There was nothing to challenge about the form. The substance was a different matter, and we both knew it, and neither of us said so. The demonstration was scheduled for the throne room on the morning of day 8, 2 hours before the midday formal session. The designated assessors were specialists Velorvath Sales and Velthar Keith, both ranked in the upper cohort tier, both trained under the senior Velsorn combat program, both selected by Commander Dean from the cohort's active roster. The formal objective was to assess the appointed contractor's capacity to perform protective response under simulated threat conditions. The informal objective was evident enough. Joram received the formal notification simultaneously with me. He came to my office in the East Annex within the hour, walking in his usual measured way that covered ground efficiently without appearing to hurry. He set the document on my desk and stood across from me. He said, "I have questions about this." I said, "Ask them." He said, "Is this a legitimate review, or is it a removal action using legitimate mechanisms?" I said, "The second." He said, "Right. Second question, do you want me to pass it or fail it?" I looked at him. He said, "I am asking because those are not the same thing. I can pass the demonstration, satisfy the assessment criteria, confirm the minimum threshold the mechanism requires, give the court something to file. The appointment continues. Orvath marks it as a qualified result and waits for the next opportunity. Or I can answer the question the demonstration is actually asking. Those produce different outcomes." I said, "What question is the demonstration actually asking?" He said, "It is asking whether a Deathworld adjacent veteran in a contractor's jacket is something this court needs to recalibrate around. They know I can satisfy the formal requirements. The contractor file shows that. The question behind the question is whether I am something they need to take seriously at a level they have not been taking seriously. That is a different demonstration than the one the form describes." I said, "How different?" He said, "The form describes an assessment. What I am describing would be a demonstration. The form expects me to perform adequately. What I am describing would give the court accurate information about what they are in the room with." I sat with that for a moment. I said, "Answer the question behind the question." He said, "I want you to know in advance that it will be fast and it will look alarming and no one will be permanently injured. I am careful about that." I said, "I understand." He said, "There is one other thing I want to say before this becomes more complicated." I said, "What?" He said, "I told you I read your husband's operational logs. I meant what I said about them. He was a person who saw clearly and chose accordingly. I have worked under people who had that quality and people who didn't, and the difference is not small. I said I believed the briefing file when it described you the same way. I still believe it. I wanted to say so while the record between us is still simple." He left. I sat at the desk for several minutes and then put the notification in the correct file and went back to the boundary survey documentation. which I had been working through in the mornings when the correspondence load was lighter. My husband had started the survey 3 years before his death and had not finished it, and it had come to me as part of everything else that had come to me, and I had found that working through it steadily in the mornings was the kind of task that kept my hands occupied while my mind did other things. The throne room was full on the morning of day 8. Full is an understatement. The standing court was present in its entirety, all 14 members, arranged along the east wall in the formal observation line that protocol required for court-requested proceedings. Advisor Orvath stood at the center. Commander Velthar Dean was at the near end, in his formal capacity as court security overseer, which gave the proceeding an official frame. There were 12 additional staff members present: senior household staff, 2 protocol officers, a record keeper, and 2 visiting dignitaries from the Velketh delegation who happened to be in residence and who had been, I was certain, quietly informed of the morning's schedule. The throne room held all of them with its usual indifference. It was built for occasions of state. This was something smaller dressed in the clothes of one. I sat in the sovereign chair, the working chair to the left of the throne, on the raised platform I used for observation proceedings. Joram was at his post position, 3 paces behind my right shoulder, slightly off the central axis, the position he had selected on the second day when he had walked the throne room with the same measuring attention he brought to every space. I had not told him where to stand. He had chosen, and the choice was correct. Specialists Sales and Keith entered from the south corridor at the appointed time. They were in formal cohort dress, which included partial plate, not full combat weight, but enough to signal that this was not a ceremony. Enough to signal that the court had taken the calibration of the exercise seriously. Both were tall, broad through the shoulders, trained in the Velsorn cohort method that emphasized controlled aggression and rapid decisive engagement. I had watched both of them in cohort assessments before, and I knew they were good. Sales was faster. Keith was stronger. Together, they were the kind of pairing that the cohort standard protocols had been developed to produce, each one covering the gap in the other's approach. Commander Dean read the formal language of the demonstration protocol. The conditions, the constraints, the stated objective, the assessment criteria. His voice was level throughout, which told me he was not comfortable with the proceeding and was maintaining the official frame precisely because he was not comfortable. He asked if the contractor was prepared. Joram said yes. He said, "The exercise will begin at my signal." The pause that followed was the kind of pause that accumulates weight from the people watching it. Everyone in that room had a judgment in reserve. The 14 members of the standing court, the 12 household staff, the 2 Velketh visitors, every one of them had arrived with a position, and the position was the same, and the position was, "This will be brief and it will be instructive, and then the appointment will be revisited through the appropriate channels. I could feel it the way you feel whether." Dean gave the signal. I want to describe what happened accurately because the court's accounts have been imprecise, and I was in the closest unobstructed position to the floor. Specialist Sales moved first, fast and direct from the left, a standard cohort opening approach, designed to draw the defender's attention and primary response, while Keith came from the right at a fractionally delayed angle. The gap between the 2 approaches was timed at approximately 1 second, which in cohort protocol is considered sufficient to force a choice. Address the first threat and accept vulnerability to the second, or split attention and be fully effective at neither. It was a sound approach. It was the approach the cohort trained for precisely, because it did not have a comfortable answer. Joram did not split his attention, and he did not address the first threat from the expected angle. He moved left, not toward Sales but diagonally, inside the arc of Sales's approach, which is not the direction a defender goes in cohort training, because going inside the arc means closing distance rather than creating it, and closing distance against an incoming threat is something the cohort method considers an error. Sales had not been trained for a response from that direction, and the adjustment required recalculation, and the recalculation took time, and in the time it took, Joram's left hand was on Sales's extended forearm, and his right hand was at a position on Sales's shoulder that I could not fully see but whose effect was immediate and complete. Specialist Sales stopped moving. Not fell, not yielded, stopped, held in a configuration where continued movement in any useful direction was not available. That was 4 seconds from the signal. Keith was committed. The approach from the right had been designed to arrive at a defender still engaged with Sales, and Keith was experienced enough to read in the first 2 seconds that the engagement was not going as designed, but the trajectory was already committed, and adjusting it under time pressure required more than 2 seconds. Joram was not where the trajectory expected him to be. He made a single lateral step, small, precise, the kind of step that does not look like movement until it has already worked, and Keith's committed approach went past the position Joram had occupied, and Joram's hand was at the back of Keith's collar, and the specialist's forward momentum redirected downward and Keith went to the floor. Controlled. Hands first, then one knee, not a fall, a placement, but not a voluntary one. 3 more seconds. 7 seconds total from the signal. Sales was standing with one arm immobile, held at an angle that prevented any use of it without Joram's releasing it. Keith was on hands and one knee on the throne room floor, in a position that required Joram's cooperation to change. Both specialists were uninjured. I watched them carefully throughout, and I am certain of this. Joram said to both of them in a voice that carried clearly without being raised, "Thank you." He released Sales's arm and stepped back from Keith, and both specialists straightened and stood. They looked at each other. They looked at Joram. Then they looked at the floor, which was what I would have looked at in their position. 7 seconds, I had counted from the signal. I held the throne room in my attention for a moment without speaking. All 14 members of the standing court, all 12 staff members, the 2 Velketh visitors, Commander Dean, Advisor Orvath. Every person in the room was looking at a small, quiet human in a gray contractor's jacket, who had moved through 2 of the Velsorn Sovereignty's upper-tier combat specialists in 7 seconds, and had come back to his post position behind my right shoulder, without having changed expression during or after. Orvath's face was running through calculations faster than he could organize them. Dean was very still, in the way of a person whose professional assessment has just been significantly revised. The 14 standing court members had the particular quality of a consensus that has been interrupted mid-formation. I let the silence run for 8 more seconds, long enough to be a statement. Then I stood. I said, "The contractor's qualifications are confirmed." No one spoke, no one moved. I said, "I want to address the court directly, since the court is present in full. The demonstration has answered the procedural question. I want to answer the question behind it, because I think the court deserves a clear answer, and I prefer to give it plainly rather than let it be inferred." I had their full attention. I had had it since the 7th second, but I had it differently now. I said, "My husband made his security appointments on the basis of what his people could actually do. I have read the accounts of those appointments going back 20 years. He chose carefully, and he chose correctly, and the court's security under his hand was sound because of it. I am making my appointments the same way." I paused. I said, "The compact contractor file for Joram Castle includes his Deathworld adjacent service record, 6 years of operations in marginal zone environments under compact joint forces, 18 years of active service before that. The file also includes his medical adaptation documentation. I read every page before I pulled his name from the roll. I want the court to understand that I did not read it and then make the appointment despite what I found there. I read it and made the appointment because of what I found there." I said, "Deathworld adjacent is the compact's administrative phrase for a category of operational experience that produces specific and permanent physiological changes in the people who undergo it. Changes in reflexive response time, changes in pain threshold, changes in healing rate, changes in the capacity to function under conditions that would incapacitate a person without that background. What you observed just now was those changes applied carefully, and I want to emphasize carefully, because what you observed was Joram Castle choosing not to injure two people he could have injured. That choice is not a limitation. It is a demonstration of control. The court should understand that the choice was available. I let that sit. I said the appointment stands. The procedural review is concluded. I am grateful to the court for the mechanism, which exists for good reasons, and I consider the morning's business closed on this matter. I will see the standing court at the midday session. I stepped down from the platform. Behind me, 3 paces back and slightly off-axis, Joram fell into his post position without being asked. We walked the length of the throne room. I heard nothing behind us, no movement, no murmur, no side conference beginning. Just the particular silence of 28 people doing the same recalculation at the same time. In the south corridor beyond the archway, when the door had closed behind us and we were alone in the anteroom passage, I said without turning, "You said it would be fast." He said it was. I said 7 seconds. He said I was being careful. It takes a little longer to be careful. I said careful meaning. He said, meaning I didn't want to hurt anyone and I didn't want to make it easy to dismiss. Those are actually competing considerations, and finding the line between them takes a second or two. I said I see. I walked another 5 steps, then I stopped. I said my husband would have liked you, I am certain of it. He said nothing for a moment. When he spoke his voice was the same as always, level, direct, no performance in it. He said, "From the operational logs, I think I would have liked him too." I started walking again. He walked behind me, 3 paces back off-axis. The corridor was cool and long, and the morning light came through the high windows in long rectangles across the floor, and we moved through them one by one toward the east wing, and the boundary survey documentation that was still open on the archive desk. The court did not raise the appointment again. Advisor Orvath filed a formal observation note 4 days after the demonstration, his right understanding protocol, and a move I had expected. The note recorded his position that the demonstration had raised substantive questions about appropriate criteria for sovereign detail appointments, and recommended a standing committee review of the compact contractor role's eligibility parameters for formal Velsorn detail postings. The language was careful and procedurally sound and entirely without force. I acknowledged it in writing, filed it in the appropriate archive, and moved on. Commander Velthar Dean requested a private meeting 2 weeks after the demonstration. He sat across the desk in the East Annex and told me, with the directness I had always found reliable in him, that he had underestimated the appointment. He used that word specifically, underestimated. He said he had reviewed the compact medical adaptation documentation the morning after the demonstration, when he could read it with the demonstration's evidence alongside it, and that he had, prior to the demonstration, read the documentation as administrative formality, the kind of record that exists for legal completeness rather than practical relevance. He said he understood now that it was neither administrative nor formal, and that the gap between what he had assumed and what was documented was his error, not the documentation's. He said he thought the court owed me an apology for the form the review had taken. I said the mechanism was legitimate. He said the mechanism was legitimate. The intention behind it was not, and I should have said so when the request was filed. I am saying so now. I said, I appreciate it, Commander, and I appreciate the directness. It is one of the things I have relied on in you. He left. I finished the boundary survey documentation that afternoon, the last 3 folios that had been waiting since the morning of the demonstration, when I had set them aside. I filed the completed survey in the formal archive with my husband's name on the original commission line and my name on the completion line, because that was accurate, and accuracy seemed like the right frame for that particular document. There is a final thing I want to include in this account. On the evening of the demonstration day, after the midday session and the afternoon correspondence and the consultation with the Velketh delegation visitors who had, it turned out, found the morning's proceedings interesting enough to request a brief formal exchange with me before their departure, I was in the East Archive with the day's work finished. The archive in the evening had been one of the rooms I could be in without difficulty since my husband's death. Most of the palace was not like that. Most of the palace held the shape of his absence in ways that were tiring, the way a very cold room is tiring. You don't feel it immediately, but it accumulates. The archive was not like that because it had been primarily mine, and the shape in it was a shape I had put there myself, and I could be in it without doing the calculation of what was different now. I was standing at the archive window looking at the south garden, which was dark, and I heard Joram in the corridor outside. Not a sound exactly, but the quality of presence that I had learned meant he had shifted slightly, checking the approach angles the way he did at regular intervals, automatic and unobtrusive, the way breathing is unobtrusive. I said without turning from the window, "Do you ever get tired?" There was a pause. He said, "Physically or otherwise?" I said, "Otherwise." He said, "Sometimes. The physical kind and the otherwise kind are different. You can sleep through the physical kind. The otherwise kind doesn't clear that way." I said, "No." He said, "It clears by waiting it out mostly, keeping the work going. Not because the work fixes it, it doesn't, but having something real in your hands while you wait is better than not having it. The work is something true. The otherwise kind of tired doesn't touch things that are true." I looked at the garden, which was dark and quiet, the velthorn trees at the south wall reduced to shapes. I said, "That is accurate." He said, "I know it from a different angle than you do. Frontier postings are their own version of it, but I think the shape of the thing is the same from either direction." I said, "Yes." I turned from the window. He was at his post in the corridor, looking at the north approach, which was what he was supposed to be looking at. The evening light from the archive lamps came through the doorway and caught the gray at his temples and the soft fabric at the elbows of the contractor's jacket. I said, "Thank you." He said, "For the assessment this morning or for just now?" I said, "Both." He said, "The assessment this morning was the work, just now was something else." I said, "Yes, it was." I went back to the desk. The survey documentation was finished, and there was nothing left to do in the archive, but I stayed anyway, reading through old correspondence folios that did not require my attention. And after a while, the otherwise kind of tired settled into something quieter, and I noticed that the archive was simply a room I was in, doing work that kept my hands occupied, with someone outside in the corridor whose presence was a kind of truth I had not known I needed until it was there. I am writing this account now, at the court's request, 3 months after the throne room demonstration. The record is as complete and accurate as I can make it. Joram Castle is still in post. The South Garden's exterior access points are logged, secured, and included in the monthly security review that he initiated and Commander Dean now formally co-signs. The corridor chair outside the private audience room is still 14 centimeters to the left of its original position and 40 degrees rotated, and the sightline from it covers all 3 approaches, and the 7th century sovereignty mural is still visible. The boundary survey documentation my husband commissioned 3 years before his death is finished and filed. I consider the morning's business closed on this matter, as I said to the court in the throne room. The account is now complete.